A very good evening to my friends in India and a very good morning to my friends in the West. So, the topic for today's discussion is, as you all know, a physics perspective of free will. So, all of us, have a basic understanding of what free will is. And before, getting into the main thing, I would also be, explaining what physics are we talking about because it's important to understand what I mean by physics over here to be able to comprehend the connection which I'm trying to draw between physics and this idea of free will. So to begin with, let us just see what does free will mean. So as a very layman's understanding, free will is basically the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate. The ability to act at one's own discretion. That is basically what free will means. Now, there's a very nice quote by our, first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who said that, life is like a game of cards. The hand you are dealt is determinism, but the way you play it is free will. So this is a very, commonsensical notion of what free will is. But as we can see, from this quote, that this is, actually quite simplistic, and reality is actually, a lot more complicated. So a very beautiful, depiction of this complication is given by none other than Buddha, and he says that all things appear and disappear because of the concurrence of causes and conditions. Nothing ever exists entirely alone. Everything is in relation to everything else. This is a very deep statement, and it actually portrays very beautifully why this question of fate and free will is so complicated. Because we may think that we are separate individuals who have a separate individuality, but actually if you think about things in a little deeper manner, we'll realize that we are all connected in some way, not in the advaitic sense, but even in a very mundane sense, that what we do, what we say, what we think, the way we dress, for example, are dependent largely on the community that we live in, the kind of culture that we belong to, the kind of religion that we profess. So we are not as independent as we think ourselves to be. And if we are not so independent, then do we really have free will? So that's a question, and that's the perspective from which this question of fate and free will actually becomes, quite complicated. So, Vivekananda went a little bit further, and he said something much, bolder and perhaps in a much blunt manner. He said, very straightforwardly that there cannot be any such thing as free will. Now that's kind of a shocking statement, but yes, Vivekananda did say that. Now, what does he mean by that? It's important to understand the context in which he was making that statement. So he says that the very words, by free will, the very words are a contradiction because will is what we know, and everything we know is within our universe. Everything within our universe is molded by the conditions of space, time, and causation. Everything that we know or possibly can know must be subject to causation, and therefore, that which obeys the law of causation cannot be free. So, Vivekananda is going one step further from what Buddha said. Buddha said that everything that exists in this world is connected with other things. So, things are perhaps not as free as we think they are. And Vivekananda straightforwardly, says that, there cannot be any such thing as free will because everything has a cause. There is nothing in this world that exists without a cause. And if a thing has a cause, it cannot really be free because for something to be free, it should be free. That there should not be anything that leads to this. But here there is a very subtle point which is very important to understand that, okay, if you are saying that everything in the universe obeys the law of causation and hence it cannot be free, but does it imply that everything is deterministic? That, what I do, what I think, it is determined by, God or the universe or something else? Does it imply that kind of conclusion? So the question is, does causation imply determinism? Okay, so Vivekananda is saying that causation implies that things are not free, but does causation imply determinism? That is the question that we are trying to understand. So here actually physics, plays a very important role, and physics can perhaps help in resolving this question. And that is through this, dichotomy between what is known as classical physics and what is known as quantum physics. So even, those of you who are not familiar with these concepts, you don't have to worry, because I will give a very brief, introduction to what I mean by classical and what I mean by quantum. So to take a very simple example, let's take this potential well, where you have some potential, u of x, in which the particle is moving. So in the classical potential well, suppose the particle has an energy E, it will move between these 2 points such that its energy remains, larger than the potential. So it cannot go to regions where the potential is larger than energy. So the energy E can take any fixed value, and this value is deterministic, that once you know the particle has energy, it always has energy. There's nothing that changes. So it just keeps going, back and forth along this straight line, which is depicted in this graph. On the other hand, quantum mechanics is very, very different from this simplistic picture. In quantum mechanics, what is known is that if you have this, kind of a potential well, let's take a simple shape of a potential well as shown in this graph. So what quantum mechanics shows is that the energies which the particle can take is not, arbitrary, but has to take some, discrete values. So as you can see in this graph, the right hand side of this graph shows some energy values, E equal to 1 by 2 hf, 3 by 2 hf, 5 by 2 hf. So in quantum mechanics, the particle can take only one of these energies and not anything in between. That is a very important difference between quantum and classical. And another important difference is that the energy of the particle is not determined, at a given point of time. That the particle can actually have any of these energies which are shown in this graph and many more, but any of these discrete values. Now, what happens is that when you make a measurement on this system, when you say want to measure what is the energy of the particle, that time the particle can drop, or what is known as, collapse of the wave function. The particle collapses to one of these energy values. So the energy of the particle is not known earlier, but it becomes defined only when you make a measurement. That is the very important difference between classical mechanics and quantum mechanics. So in some sense, the energy of the particle in quantum mechanics is some kind of a random value, and it can take any of these, discrete values with certain probability. So that is the, very important difference between classical and quantum mechanics. So the question this leads to is our, human brain or the human mind classical or quantum? Because that is where the question of fate or free will, actually comes in. So if the human mind is, purely classical, then there cannot be a free will, because obviously if the mind obeys, classical laws, once you know that law, everything else, is known. That once you know the law, once you know the initial condition, all the future states of the brain and the mind can be known exactly. There is no question of, any such thing as free will. But there are some evidences, which are coming up over the last, few years, which shows that perhaps, that the human brain and the human mind do not obey classical laws, but they obey quantum laws. That there is some amount of randomness in our brain, which might lead to, non-determinism coming into play in some way. But the question is, but if the brain obeys quantum mechanics, does it imply the existence of free will? So that's a question that, needs to be addressed. That usually we talk of fate versus free will, but are these only two options which exist, or there can be a third option perhaps, which, this quantum physics actually, might throw up. So instead of just debating between fate and free will, we need to be a little more, little more adventurous in some sense, and look for other possibilities which this quantum physics may actually throw up. So the important thing to understand over here is that even if our brain is obeying quantum mechanical laws, and even if it is responsible for random thoughts that arise in the brain, but still this process most likely happens in the unconscious part of the brain. As we know that the brain is divided into the conscious part, the subconscious part, and the unconscious part. And most of our thoughts, most of our decisions actually arise in the unconscious or the subconscious part. So even if quantum mechanics is responsible for the random thoughts that arise in the brain, that process is happening in the unconscious part and is not necessarily connected with what we call as free will, because free will by definition is a conscious activity. So existence of random thoughts is not the same as free will. That is something that is very, very important for us to understand. That our brain most likely has some randomness into it because of various reasons, but the presence of randomness does not imply the presence of free will. So this difference between random thoughts and free will is something very important to understand. So I would like to repeat some of the points which I just said. The first thing is that the conscious part of the mind is only a small fraction of the total. Most of the mind is unconscious or subconscious. Most of the random thoughts which arise in our mind, they do so in the unconscious or the subconscious mind. And actually that is where most of our decisions are taken. For example, I am giving this talk, but if you ask me what is the word which I am going to say next, I will not be able to tell you, because that is somehow decided by processes which are not totally under my control currently. And we become aware about our thoughts and choices only when they rise to the level of the conscious mind, not otherwise. So thoughts and choices arise in a part of the mind and the brain which is not exactly under our control. So presence of random thoughts is not the same as free will. So there is a very nice quote by Sam Harris, who is a scientist, very, very renowned scientist, and he said that you can do what you decide to do, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. That's a very kind of might appear confusing in the start, but that's a very profound statement, that you, once you decide to do something, you can of course go ahead and do it, but you actually cannot decide what you're going to decide. That's something that's in some sense beyond your control. But he goes on to say that losing a belief in free will has not made me fatalistic. So there is a difference between these two things. Free will and being fatalistic are not the only two options. There are more possibilities that actually exist in nature. And Sam says that losing a belief in free will has not made me fatalistic. In fact, it has increased my feelings of freedom. My hopes, fears, and neuroses seem less personal and indelible. There is no telling how much I might change in the future. Just as one would not draw a lasting conclusion about oneself on the basis of a brief experience of indigestion, one need not do so on the basis of how one has thought or behaved for vast stretches of time in the past. A creative change of inputs to the system, learning new skills, forming new relationships, adopting new habits of attention may radically transform one's life. So this offers a very different, but perhaps a perspective which is perhaps much more closer to reality, that instead of worrying about whether our life is predetermined or whether we have free will, perhaps it's neither. Neither is everything determined, neither are we really free, because as Buddha said, we are all connected with each other. But perhaps the beauty of the situation is that if we can change our surroundings, our environments, our habits in interesting ways, then that can radically transform our life in ways that even we could not have imagined. And that is a very, very interesting possibility which we all must explore. So, in between this debate of fate and free will, what quantum mechanics or perhaps physics, what perhaps it throws up, is this idea of infinite possibilities. Instead of making the philosophy centered to our own, freedom, or centered to the decision of some, God or universe, we could believe in the existence of infinite possibilities, that, tomorrow anything could happen, in a positive way. And as Eckhart Tolle said, is that life is an adventure, it's not a package tour. And Joseph Campbell added on and said that the big question is whether you are going to be able to say a hearty yes to your adventure. So instead of being bogged down by fate, or instead of becoming, too much, engrossed in this debate on free will, perhaps we can embrace life as an adventure and just, seek out new pastures, seek out new habits, seek out new people, new environments, which actually can have a very profound effect on our life and in perhaps ways which even we could not have thought of. So that is all that I have to share on this topic. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer. You can either raise the question symbol, or you can type in the question box, and I can then read out the question and share my thoughts on that. Yes, Mr. Sriram, I'm going to unmute you.
That even this
Yes, Mr.
adventure is predetermined.
Please, can you repeat your question, Mr. Sriram?
Yeah, there is a school of thought which probably says that even the adventure which you talked about is predetermined, even though you don't know, but even that is predetermined.
Yeah, as in, of course, one can, of course, say that everything that we do is predetermined. But I come from a physics background, and I guess it's, almost, quite accepted that that this idea of predeterminism actually comes from the idea of classical mechanics. Where once you have an equation and once you have the initial conditions, everything else is can be ascertained with absolute certainty. But I guess this advent of quantum mechanics is not just restricted to physics, but I think it applies to life in general. That that even if you have an equation describing the universe, and even if you have all the initial conditions, but still you do not really know what forms the solutions may take in the future. So I personally strongly believe in physics, and going by the way physics has developed over the last 100 120 years, it's sort of quite clear that that this absolute determinism is perhaps not a reality. But of course there is no proof that quantum mechanics applies to everything in the universe. And even great scientists like Albert Einstein never accepted it. Actually, his famous statement that God does not play dice. uh, so of course we are entitled to our views, and perhaps there will never be a proof of this statement. So I guess as far as the physics perspective is concerned, which is what we are discussing today, from the physics perspective, I guess determinism is more or less out of the box now. Does that answer your question, Mr. Shriram?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So yeah, two different viewpoints. So the question is, yeah, there is no proof for either in
Yes,
an absolute
yes. You
sense.
don't have a proof for either, so it becomes more of a case of what works for you, basically. Yes, yeah, yeah.
Second question I had was, you brought up the topic of the conscious mind, the subconscious mind, and the unconscious mind.
Uh-huh.
But once again, Vedanta says that as the Atman or Brahman, are aware of everything that happens, at your mind. You're transcending the body, mind, and intellect because of the fact that you are aware of your body, you're aware of your mind,
Mm-hmm.
you're aware of your intellect, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So how exactly does that correlate with this subconscious and the unconscious mind?
So once once a person has reached that stage, the stage of a Buddha or a Vivekananda, then I guess all these questions and all these terminologies are totally meaningless at that stage. Definitely, for a Vivekananda, perhaps these things are kind of meaningless. But at our level, when we have not reached that stage, where we can actually see these things differently, that we do not really experience the Atman in the way Vedanta describes it. So for us, these things, are realities. But once we reach that stage, perhaps these things will not hold much meaning to us. But that is something that I cannot comment on, because I can only comment on things that are a part of my experience, which I can see in front of my eyes, or from my thoughts. So for me and for us, I guess these divisions are a reality, that we can clearly see that this conscious mind and unconscious mind are two different things. But yeah, as you said, once one rises higher in the ladder, perhaps these things will dissolve. But that's something that's for the future to tell us. Right now, I don't know. Does that answer your question, Mr. Shriram?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, since none of us, yeah, at least since I'm not a real life person, I guess I cannot answer the question either.
Yeah.
But
So
perhaps,
yeah.
but perhaps if Swamiji is on the line or something like that, maybe he can comment on.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, I guess it's better to talk about things that are a reality for me. So it's very easy to quote from the scriptures, but but unless we actually experience that, I guess it doesn't really hold much meaning actually. So, would you like to ask anything else, Mr. Shriram?
No, perhaps others can chime in and comment on these things.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? You can also type in the box below, and then I will read out the question.
Kushalji, the Ranjan Desai is asking question.
Yes, please.
His hand is.
I cannot. Ranjan, this. Right. I'll unmute him. Okay. Hello. Can you hear me, Mr. Ranjan?
Yeah, I can hear you. Good. Thank you again for a good absorbing presentation that you have given.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so it's pretty interesting what you have talked and what Sriram just asked also about the information and so the question that I had was, you said the energy is constant at that, right?
Right.
So yeah, so there are different types of energies also, isn't it? So there, you can like, is it the fixed type of energy that you have that you can acquire, or you can add more, or like how could you say that just that the energy is just constant in the like the classical, and then here also in that? So in quantum mechanics, you said that could change, right? That's what it means, that you have different types of energy and all.
Right.
So, I mean, do you acquire that type of energy from different places? I mean, if you talk about free will and all, like how
No.
I didn't get.
So in quantum mechanics, what happens is that it is not different kinds of energy, but our notion that say in classical mechanics we have this idea of conservation of energy, which is in which we say that the total energy of the system remains constant.
Uh-huh.
So that is kind of a classical mechanical perspective. But in quantum mechanics, although the conservation law still applies, but it applies in a different way. So all the levels which I showed you, that 1 by 2 HF, 3 by 2 HF, they are not different
Right.
kinds of energy, but different values for the total energy. So in classical mechanics, once you have a particle in this potential well, its energy remains constant forever. But in quantum
Okay.
mechanics, the energy is not known a priori, that the energy can be any of those values with a certain probability.
Oh, so where will the other part of energy be then at that point of time? With
No,
the other person or with somebody else or with?
nowhere. So it is a very different way of thinking compared to classical mechanics. So the particle actually, so there are these actual interpretations of quantum mechanics is a very great and deep philosophical domain, and there is still no resolution really to it. And you can interpret quantum mechanics in different ways. So one way of interpreting is it is that the particle actually does not have any energy till you make a measurement.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so that leads to this idea of conscious agents and many other complications. So the idea is that
Uh-huh.
all that we know before making a measurement is the probability that the particle will have a certain energy. That's all. But the particle has a definite energy only after we have made the measurement. So we have a
Oh, okay.
system in which we have a particle moving, and before we make the measurement, the particle does not have any energy as such. It only has probabilities.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if
Okay.
we say have thousand such systems, and if we make
Mm.
measurement on all thousand such systems, then the particle will have say 1 by 2 HF in say 5 of those boxes. It will have energy of say 3 by 2 HF in say 10 of those boxes. So it's a very
Okay.
statistical kind of picture. So the energies actually do not exist anywhere. They are just probabilities basically.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. I think it explains me. I think let me look at it more and see if I've, no,
Thank you so much.
yeah, it's pretty interesting actually. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kushalji, there are two questions in the question box.
Okay. So there is one question by Mr.
One
Gopal Krishnan.
question,
He says,
yes, and another is Vaman.
yeah. So Mr. Gopal Krishnan says that staying in the now and go along life, is it free will or fate? Very interesting. So this is sort of very nice summary of actually what we have discussed so far. That when we talk of adventure, when we talk of life as an adventure, more or less we are talking about staying in the now, that living in the present and go as life takes you. Now, is that free will or fate? As again I mentioned, it is neither of these. It is not fate because your experience of now is not determined completely by what has happened in the past. But it is not free will also because there is a causation involved. As Vivekananda has said that whatever we do in life, there is a certain causation that plays a role in determining everything. So if there is causation, we cannot really have free will because free will has to be free, without being limited to or without being influenced by anything, which is not possible. As Buddha also has said, that everything that exists in this world is related to each other. So it cannot be free will and it cannot also be fate because the possibilities are infinite. And which possibility materializes in the now currently is not determined a priori. You know about it only when the present actually happens. So staying in the now is the same as taking life as an adventure, and it is neither free will nor fate. It is just infinite possibilities that we have to embrace with open arms. Does that answer your question, Mr. Gopal Krishnan? So there is another question by Mr. Vamna. He says, if we are not in a position to decide what we can decide, does it mean that we have no control over what we do ultimately? That's a very interesting question, actually, and little tricky to answer because if we say that we have no control over what we do ultimately, that may lead to a situation where we stop taking responsibility for our actions. And history has shown that that is not a good situation to be in, because if a person does not take responsibility for his or her actions and decisions, that can lead to the person doing all kinds of things in the name of destiny. But if we say that we have 100% control over what we do, that is also not really true. Because many things that we decide, for example, we choose a particular profession, that suppose I am a physicist, some of you may be investment bankers, some of you may be accountants, some of you may be doctors. So how did we come to this decision that we will take this profession? If we actually think about it, we will not be able to point out a very logical set of rules that we follow to come to this conclusion that we must take this profession. So we do not have complete control over what we do, and it is also not true that we have no control over what happens. So it's something like how we live in a family. Say there is a husband, there is a wife, there are children, there are parents. So what gets decided in every family is more or less some kind of an average of what all these people in the family think and what they want to do. That sometimes what the husband says is accepted, sometimes what the wife says is accepted, sometimes what the children says is accepted. So more or less it's kind of an average of all of these decision makings which is happening. A similar thing happens in for each individual also, because if you think about it, we are all families in ourselves. Our brain, our liver, our lungs, our cells, our hands, our feet, they also have a certain kind of individuality to themselves, and they also have a certain amount of control on what actually gets done eventually through this individual self. So actually no one entity in this system has complete control. The brain is not really the final overpowering thing over all our decisions. There are certain decisions which are actually taken by our tongue. If the tongue wants to have a burger, even if your stomach is upset, sometimes you just go and do it. So there, who has taken the decision? Actually it's nobody in particular, just that at that moment the decision of the tongue was more overpowering over the decision of the other entity in this family called body. So to kind of repeat what I just said, that we neither have complete control, nor is it that we have no control. It is just like a family where what gets done is some kind of an average of what all the people in the family think and do at different points of time. So for me personally, it is very helpful to think of my body, my individuality as a family rather than just being a single entity. That really helps in managing situations very well sometimes. Does that answer your question, Mr. Nayak? Okay. Thank you. Are there any more questions? Shall we wait for some more time, Vivaji?
It's okay. I don't think now if they would have asked otherwise.
Okay, so shall we close?
Yes, I think.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Kushalji. It was very interesting.
Thank you,
And
Vivaji,
actually,
for
the topic is mind-boggling, so it's no conclusion can be reached here. That is also
yes,
reality.
this is the only conclusion that no conclusion can be reached.
So, yeah, your presentation was very good. Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Kushalji.
much. Thank you once again, and thank you for all for attending this. If you have any further, point which you would like to discuss, please feel free to email me. I'll be very happy to discuss over email. Thank you so much once again. Thank you.
Oh.